I will never forget the smell of that wallpaper. It was the kind of floral pattern that pretended to be cheerful while everyone in the room knew it had been hanging since before I was born, edges curling like old paper after a rain. The day they thought they had me figured out, I sat in that living room while they mapped my future on napkins and phones like I was a piece of furniture they could move. They laughed when I said nothing. They liked it that way. They called me steady, simple, the kind of man who kept his head down and his hands clean. I learned young that silence was cheaper than arguing with people who already decided my place. I can see it all now like a scene from some cheap drama. My sister perched on the arm of the couch, her stilettos making hollow noises against my grandfather's hardwood, my mother with a ledger and a permanent scowl, my brother texting a lawyer from under his breath. They were planning a future that included a new house in the suburbs, a 5-bedroom model with a pool for someone else to worry about. They were planning to strip the business of its old heart and dress it up for investors. They were planning in the most practical and efficient way they knew how to cut me out. Their voices were clinical, as if they were discussing plumbing, not the person who had lived in this house his entire life and kept the garden from dying in July. They never consulted me, that was the point. They assumed my silence was consent, cheap, easy, pliable. He doesn't care, my sister said once like it was a diagnosis. Let him have his little room, he likes his little routines. They would say things like that and the letters would come 3 days later. Notices, proposals, drafts with my name misspelled because no one had bothered to address me properly. They mocked my job at the print shop, the one my grandfather started, the one that smelled of ink and dust and honest machines. They called it small, quaint, and anachronism in their modern spreadsheets. Who prints anymore? My brother scoffed, smacking his fingers. Everything's digital. What they said in the open was petty and loud. In the quiet, when they thought I couldn't hear, their plans became sharper. They whispered about selling the house to pay off some new venture, about giving the business a clean break and letting a private equity firm swallow it whole. They shuffled around probate papers like a deck they were eager to reshuffle. They planned to reassign my little office in the back of the print shop, to change the locks on the basement, to change the locks on me. They talked as if I were a draft animal, as if lineage and loyalty were negotiable. They had convinced themselves I was nothing more than scenery, and that is a dangerous thing to believe about a person. I let them believe it for a long time because I had reasons to be quiet, reasons that made sense to me and no one else. My days were spent keeping the presses alive, delivering invoices, sweeping up stray paper like I was sweeping up the rest of my life. I watched customers come and go, watched teenagers ask for posters and older men needing a letterhead, and I thought about how my grandfather would have rolled his eyes at all of us. He was a man who knew how to read people and how to tuck a safeguard into a will without making a fuss. He used to sit me on his knee and say little things like, "One day you'll be glad you were good and small. People never see you coming." Nobody believed him. They believed in ambition measured by suits and meetings, by flights and new roofs. They measured worth by bank accounts and LinkedIn profiles. My family measured me by the wallpaper in the corner room where I slept, by the slow way I brewed tea each morning, by my reluctance to inherit their fury. Because of that, they made plans over me without telling me, signed forms they assumed I'd never notice, scheduled a meeting to decide whether I even deserved a chair at the company table. They called it a family meeting and invited a lawyer who wore a smile that smelled like tax returns. They thought they were clever, orchestrating the eviction of what they called the family's dead weight, while they rebranded and polished the parts of us that glittered. I was keeping my own counsel, and that kept me company through long afternoons. I worked like I always had, fixing the machines, making sure each print came out straight. Sometimes I would catch myself tracing the pattern of the wallpaper where it peeled at the seam, thinking of the funny ways family stories stick to walls. I started to notice little things in the margins of ledgers, the kinds of things people leave when they are certain no one is watching. A name written in my grandfather's careful hand, a stamp pressed under a pile of receipts, a drawer that clicked in a way that only someone who had used it for 40 years could expect. Those small, almost accidental things are the way truth hides when everyone wants a nicer story. They planned and laughed and arranged my removal like a puzzle they could finish by Saturday. I sat there and listened and let them think me harmless. I do not tell this because I was noble about it. I tell it because the quiet was a choice that had to be made. I learned to let them have their parade because the moment they were loudest is always when they make the biggest mistake. When somebody believes you are a footnote, they do not guard the chapters that will one day burn their whole book. I had a few quiet plans of my own too, and one of them involved that wallpaper and the secrets tucked behind it. My grandfather liked tiny, private jokes. He used to tuck things in odd places and then watch people trip over them when they learned the truth. I remember once he hid a silver coin in my shoe just to see how long it would take me to find it. He would laugh and say, "You learn the worth of things by how long they stay hidden." That sense of humor was the last proof I needed that he saw me. While everyone else squinted at me and decided I was slow, Grandpa smiled like he had seen all the moves stacked on a chessboard years ahead. After the meeting with the lawyer, after the papers were pushed across the table and my name was mentioned like an inconvenience, I went home and pulled at that curling wallpaper. It was mostly an excuse to be near the place where my life lived and where my grandfather had sat in the same chair and read the same yellowing newspapers. Behind the second strip, my fingers found a tin cigarette case folded with a ribbon. Inside was a thin stack of documents, a photocopy of a stock certificate, and a letter in my grandfather's cramped hand that read more like a confession than instructions. He explained things as if I had always known. He had set up the family company so that control did not live where money said it lived. Years before, when my cousins were all polishing resumes and my mother was pressuring him to hand over the keys, Grandpa quietly moved the voting shares into a trust. He named no slick cousin, no lawyer with a new haircut. He named a set of conditions instead. The trust was old-fashioned and stubborn, written with words that favored stewardship over flamboyance. He had the foresight, the stubbornness, to anchor the company and the house to a guardian who would protect them if greed moved in. My grandfather's letter was simple and precise. He told me he had seen their eyes get soft when they smelled new money, that they would change when opportunity knocked. He did not call me slow, he called me steady. He said he chose me because I had the one quality he respected most. I would not be tempted to break things for a faster life. There it was, a quiet compliment that felt like a challenge. He explained the clause that mattered. If any majority of the family attempted to remove a member from the house or strip an employee of their role without cause, the trust would trigger a transfer of voting control to the trustee who would distribute oversight differently. The trustee was a small local bank, but the beneficiary instructions were explicit. He had made me the eventual steward if that clause activated. Nobody asked me to be wise. He did. The documents included a map of where to find the original share certificates and patent paperwork, a small set of keys, and a note about the patent that people had assumed belonged to a corporation. Grandpa had patented a particular press die and a layout trick that saved paper and cut costs. It was one of those ugly, functional inventions that nobody admired but everyone used. Over the years, companies licensed it without thinking about the origin. People assumed everything was corporate property. Grandpa had quietly kept the patent in a personal name and paid the renewal by slipping checks into envelopes like he slipped stories into my ear. No one had noticed because no one ever noticed the man who putteringly fixed their problems. I remember the taste of dust when I slid open the old filing drawer behind the wallpaper. There was the original certificate, a faded embossed seal, and a strike-through grainy copy of the latest license agreement that my cousins had signed thinking they were doing me a favor. They had been careless. Somewhere along the line, they had tried to restructure ownership quickly to absorb the patent into the new holding company so the venture boys would like the balance sheet. They had signed documents they thought were final. What they did not realize was the trust my grandfather set up required unanimous family approval to transfer the patent or the company in ways that removed a family member from residence or work. They had not gotten unanimity. They had gotten what they assumed was a signature from me, a scrawl I had never made. There was one more thing, a small, practical detail that made the difference. Grandpa had named a trustee who was not a person hungry for headlines, but a local bank that did exactly what banks do, hold and follow instructions. The bank would only act when presented with clear evidence of misconduct or an attempt to evict a family member without due process. Grandpa had set the bar high not to protect me alone, but to protect all of us from our own worst impulses. The trust would activate only in specific circumstances that, as he wrote, were the ones most likely to happen when people thought they had everything to gain and nothing to lose. I kept those papers folded in my pocket for weeks. I am no vigilante of paper and pens. I had never wanted to be the guy who wielded power like a club. But there is a difference between setting something aside and letting it rot. Each day, when my family talked louder in the kitchen about redoing the house and moving me to the basement, I thought of Grandpa's handwriting. Each time my sister smiled like a magician about the deal she was courting, I remembered the seal on the patent and the clause that was sharp enough to cut through bravado. I did not tell them. I let them keep the sound of their own laughter. It is easier to watch someone step into a trap if you care how it ends. There is a strange kind of intimacy that grows between a person and a secret they did not create. I handled those documents with the same sort of careful reverence my grandfather had used to oil a press. In the back of the tin, I found a list of small things he wanted maintained. The Sunday lunch for retired employees, the one-window view in my room kept for a certain man who liked to watch the street, the garden path that needed regular raking. He was petty and tender, a man who believed justice had the face of common sense. He had not left me a weapon so much as a responsibility. That knowledge burned like warm coal when my family crossed the line, and I began to understand the soft power of patience. They thought they had the map and the scissors and the patience to cut me out without a second thought, and that night I learned how loud cruelty sounds when it's bored. It was after 10. The house had shuffled into that sleepy stillness where the old clock in the hallway sounded like someone clearing their throat, and I was up on the landing pretending to look for a light bulb. I wasn't pretending about the bulb. I wanted to see their faces close enough to count the lies in their mouths. My hand brushed the wallpaper I had been peeling, and the curl in the corner was a kind of small luck. It let me slide the strip and watch the kitchen as if it were a stage. They were all there, my sister with lipstick that made her look sharper than the conversation needed, my mother with the old ledger under her arm like a shield, my brother wearing the same smirk he'd worn since he learned how to interrupt me. There was a folder on the table, thick and neat, labeled transfer and signed in blue ink by someone who clearly believed signatures were like stamps, easy to press down. They laughed and clicked their wine glasses the way people do when they mean well by the world and not the people in it. "We can list it next month," my sister said. "We can flip the house and be golden before he even knows what a closing is." The word closing landed like a stone. They spoke in that language of numbers and quick fixes, the kind that erases people. "We get the appraisal, present the board with a fresh plan, reorganize the equity," my brother said, as if company structure was a suit you could change at a whim. "Who still uses that old press anyway? We pivot, we cut the staff that underperforms." He said underperforms with a curl that included me. He proposed hiring a younger manager, a guy who'd smile through profit margins and not bother with the old print runs that kept half the town supplied. They smiled at the thought of my little office cleared and rented. They also called the plan tidy and legal, which made their mouths go limp with certainty. "We get a doctor to evaluate him," my mother said, and their laughter softened into a predatory sort of calm. "Declare him incapable of handling his affairs, get temporary guardianship, and then the signatures follow. It will be so clean." They all nodded like they were practicing mercy. Mercy in their mouths sounded like a form you fill out in triplicate. My chest tightened at the word incapable, because I had never felt more capable than in that hum of presses and ink. They saw me as someone who could be signed away because they believed I had nothing to fight back with. There was a detachment to how they treated the house, like a sweater you'd donate when it stopped fitting your ego. "We won't even tell him until it's done," my sister said, rolling her eyes. "He sleeps in that tiny room because he likes the view of the street. We'll put it on listing as a charming studio. Who won't love exposed hardwood and vintage wallpaper?" The same wallpaper they'd always called homey now became a selling point in their mouths, a thing to package and sell. They clicked through photos on a tablet, marking angles for staging, as if I were a prop to be positioned beside a mid-century lamp. They talked about the patent like it was obsolete, a dusty cog that could be quietly transferred. "We can consolidate the IP under the holding company," the brother said, as if he had already done the accounting in his head. "Once it's ours, investors will strip it for parts and we get the capital. We don't need to keep the press, not with a licensing deal." They imagined contracts signed and checks cleared, their greed drawing a map of where they'd spend the money. A new kitchen, a downtown condo, a name on a glass door. They didn't imagine me in any of it because they'd convinced themselves I belonged to yesterday. They were talking about moving me into assisted living as if it were a favor. They named doctors and lawyers who owed them favors and joked about choosing the nicest carpet for my room while the jagged sound of their plotting padded across the table like a satisfied animal. They even mentioned changing locks on the shop, a detail that made my palms go numb because locks are the final polite lie some people tell when they think they've finished someone off. They smiled and clinked their glasses again and said, "It will be so easy." They believed that more than prayer. I stood there and heard it all in the same breath I had used for 100 small kindnesses in a life that seemed to mean nothing to them. I felt old and young at once, old with the wear of being underestimated and young with the sudden sharpness of knowing what I would not let happen. I did not storm in. I did not shout. I slid back down the stairs like someone closing a book that was better read quietly and kept the sound of their plotting folded inside me like a letter. The night smelled of coffee and whatever perfume my sister wore to make her voice glassy. The wallpaper curled in my fingers, and I practiced a smile so tame it would make them comfortable enough to keep revealing everything they intended to do. They were proud of their plan, and proud plans are careless. I became very good at looking like someone who had lost the map. I moved through the house with the slow, agreeable face I had practiced for years, answering questions with a downturned mouth and a shrug that said I was conquered. I watered the garden in the morning and sat on the same cracked porch step while they shouted about appraisals and inspectors as if I were wallpaper taking notes. When my sister asked if I had any objections to the listing, I rubbed my hands like a man more interested in cold tea than conflict and mumbled that I trusted their judgment. They smiled like hunters who had finally seen prey pretend to sleep. They took my meekness as a kind of victory. They tightened plans and handed tasks out by habit, the way people hand a broom to the person they assume will sweep. My mother asked me to gather old receipts for the accountant, a cruel sort of joke because those receipts were the breadcrumbs to the story I kept in my pocket. I brought her the box labeled miscellaneous that sat under the counter and let her flip through faded invoices until she yawned and said, "That's fine, we'll sort the rest." Every time they made a move they left fingerprints they thought were wiped clean. I watched their confidence grow like a fire they felt they had set in a safe. I let them change a lock on the back door because I wanted them to feel the neat finality of a bolt. I signed forms they slid across my kitchen table when they insisted I sign simply to show cooperation. I answered dull questions for the doctor they called in, blinking slow and using the right words when asked if I felt overwhelmed, if daytime naps had become more frequent. I spoke like a man who was tired and not a man who was testing a long patience, letting a doctor with a clipboard and polite eyes write notes as if my mind were fraying. When they asked for samples of my handwriting for an innocuous form, I gave them my most careless scrawl and made their eyebrows relax further. While they celebrated the progress, I was building an archive in the back room of the print shop where the presses hummed like a good secret. I cleaned the old ledgers and found invoice numbers that matched patent renewals, photocopies of checks my grandfather had sent by hand, and stamped envelopes that proved payments for licensing fees had gone into a personal account. I photographed the faded certificate with my phone and timestamped it, then printed the copies on the oldest press in the shop so I would have a voice for every page. I kept a ledger of my own in a neat column, listing dates, names, and the exact words I had heard in that kitchen at night. When my brother called to boast about a meeting, I wrote down the time and saved the voice message as proof of intent. I started to pull people quietly into the margin of my plan. Old employees who had been with my grandfather for decades came by with coffee and slow smiles. They remembered a lunch schedule and routines that mattered to the company beyond profit. One of them, a woman who had run the bindery for 40 years, agreed to sign a statement about the trust my grandfather had spoken of in passing, because she had seen the man tuck things away and she believed in his stubborn decency. I collected their short witness statements on plain paper and asked them to date and sign without fanfare. They were not lawyers. They were the human memory of what the company had been and what my grandfather had tried to protect. I also made careful copies of the emails my sister had sent to the lawyer, the glib messages about consolidation, and the issue with him that I had saved on my laptop because I sometimes logged onto the family account to check invoices. I kept recordings of conversations where they used phrases like "declare him incapable" and "we'll need a temporary guardian." I stacked those files next to the faded patent certificate and grandpa's letter and organized everything into a binder that looked, from the outside, like the sort of quiet thing a man who ran a shop would have: receipts, manuals, small notes. Inside was a collection of deliberate evidence, a slow-building case. There were evenings I hated myself for the act. I practiced the right amount of confusion in the mirror, polished my apologetic smile until my face felt foreign. I went to the meetings and agreed with their appraisers and their staging notes, nodded when they took measurements of my room that would make it perfect for a listing, and pretended to be relieved when they talked about the struggling press. All the while I felt the precise tightness of someone readying a rope that would be cast at the perfect moment. Their confidence was a fragile thing, and I kept feeding it to make them bolder. If they moved too early, I would lose the chance to make the moment hit like thunder. At night, I reread Grandpa's letter until the words felt like tools, memorizing the clause that demanded unanimity and the conditions that would force the trustee to act. I arranged meetings with a young lawyer I knew from church, a man who had once fixed a zoning issue for our neighbor without fanfare. He looked at the documents with the sort of disbelief that reads like respect and told me to keep calm and let them play their hands. That was what I planned to do. I let them stack their chips, organizing their final move in full view, so that the last card I played would not be another small thing they could ignore but a blow sharp enough to change everything. They called it a family meeting and they treated it like an event, the kind that needed chairs in a semicircle and someone in a suit to make it official. The living room smelled like lemon cleaner and expensive cologne, a smell my sister must have bought to lift the house out of its age. A man from a downtown law firm sat at the head of the table with a leather folder and a look that said he had done this many times for people who like to feel clever. A real estate agent had a tablet and a slideshow and a ring light tucked under her arm, as if she expected to live stream the moment to an eager buyer. My mother hovered near the ledger, my brother leaned back with that same smirk, and my sister wore a smile that meant she had rehearsed triumph in front of a mirror. They were surrounded by props for what they believed would be the final act: an appraiser on retainer, a doctor on the phone waiting to verify incapacity, and a notary whose pen was shiny and new. They arranged the documents like surgeons laying out instruments. There was a tidy stack of eviction notices printed on crisp stock, a guardianship form with lines for signatures, and a formal transfer agreement for the family business that looked like a contract and sounded like a verdict when my brother described it. "We can get the temporary guardianship this week," the lawyer said with the calm of someone who deals in consent rather than conscience. "Once that's in place, moving to reassign authority is straightforward. The house can be listed as early as Monday, and the holding company will accept consolidation of assets once we present evidence of incapacity." He clicked the pen like a metronome, and the house hummed with confidence. The real estate agent swiped through photos of staged rooms, her voice light and persuasive. "Exposed hardwood, original moldings, vintage wallpaper intact. We market it as a charming studio with income potential. Buyers will love the story." They all laughed at the word story because in their mouth story meant a marketing line and not a life. My sister leaned forward and began to outline how they would split proceeds and roll the remainder into a new venture. They sketched spreadsheets on napkins like architects drafting someone else's future. They discussed price ranges and renovations, and how long it would take to find a buyer willing to pay for nostalgia disguised as profit. They imagined the house as a commodity, and we were an inconvenient line item. At one point, my mother pressed the ledger closed and said softly, as if comforting herself more than me, "We are doing what is best. He will be safer somewhere calm." They all nodded in chorus like they were part of a choir of good intentions. The doctor on the phone asked a few questions and my sister answered them with practiced patience, describing frequent naps, forgetful moments, how he had become more set in his ways. I could feel the air press on my chest like a hand. Inside, the press in my shop clicked and cranked and kept its steady, tireless rhythm. Outside, a plan was assembling like a machine built to grind. They brought out a prepared form and the lawyer announced the timeline as if it were a completion certificate. "We just need to proceed with a temporary guardianship hearing, submit the affidavits, and the judge typically grants these in short order when presented with consistent testimony," he explained. My sister produced a typed statement about my well-being and handed it to him as if offering proof on a silver tray. My brother spoke up about changing locks at the shop and assigning a new manager to streamline production. They all traded small cruelty like currency: a line about assisted living, a joke about a nicer rug, a suggestion of a calendar for social activities they imagined I would enjoy. Their voices were bright and ordinary, the way people sound when they are certain a door is closing for everybody else. I let them have the sound of their triumph. I sat at the end of the table and folded my hands in my lap and practiced looking like a man whose map had been taken. I asked questions with a mild tilt of the head, soft and empty, like a man who had resigned himself to events. I offered banal answers that made them relax, further little phrases about trusting their judgment and worrying only about the dog and the garden. They smiled and talked to me like a man who had lost his keys, and not a man who might file away small proofs while they weren't watching. Every confident sentence they spoke landed in the room like a nail they thought had fastened the plan. What they did not see was the way I slid the corner of Grandpa's letter against my palm beneath the table and felt the tiny ridges of the seal through the paper. My lawyer from church sat near the back, hands folded, the quiet face of someone who had promised to be patient. The bindery woman and an old shop hand had come early and stood near the doorway pretending to browse the photos, their presence like two quiet witnesses at a trial. I kept my voice small, my concern convincing, and let them bring out the pen they imagined would finish me. My sister held it up with the flourish of a person handing a microphone to silence me. "If you have nothing to hide, sign here," she said, as if my signature could make everything legal and clean. They believed it was over. They had lined up professionals and plans, they had allocated money and roles and future kitchen faucets. They were ready to move the pieces and call the movers. The room was so full of certainty that it felt like a taut rope stretched across a gorge. The stage was set, the audience seated, and everyone waited for me to give them the curtain call they had already written. I breathed in slowly, tasting the lemon and the cologne and the old ink in my mouth, and kept my hands folded as if I were a man who had only just learned how to be pushed out of his own life. They slid the eviction notice across the table with the same smirk that had been carved into their faces for weeks, like they were presenting a birthday card. The lawyer tapped the crisp paper with his pen and said the words everyone had practiced hearing: temporary guardianship, transfer of authority, immediate reassignment. My sister's smile was so bright it looked like a blade. My chest tightened, not with fear but with a clear coldness I had been warming for months. I watched the pen hover. I watched their eyes search mine for the small, defeated look they had reduced me to. I gave them none of it. I placed my hands flat on my knees, breathed in slowly, and then I slid the tin cigarette case across the table like it was a trick on a dinner napkin. Inside the tin were the originals, not copies, my grandfather's embossed certificate, the patent registration stamped and current, the deed with my name and a neat seal that had cost someone a small talent for secrecy. I had photographed and printed them to show at need, but I kept one original in my pocket like a living thing. When it hit the wood, the room went quiet in a way that makes a person notice the sound of their own heartbeat. The lawyer who sat beside me, the young man from church who had quietly promised to wait, opened his folder and set a prepared binder beside the tin. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath until someone else could speak what needed saying. He spoke slowly and clearly, the way men do when they are about to explain a rope to a room full of climbers who think they already tied it. These documents establish current ownership and trust activation conditions, he said, placing Grandpa's letter face up so that the handwriting spilled into the light. He read the clause aloud, the one Grandpa had written with old ink and older intention. Unanimous family consent required for transfer of the patent or eviction of a resident who is a working member of the company, and automatic trustee intervention when any attempt is made to remove a family member without cause. He named the trustee and produced a letter from the bank confirming readiness to enforce those instructions. The lawyer's voice did not shake. Neither did mine. My sister laughed first, a short, brittle sound that fell like glass. "You have to be kidding. Who tucks all this away in a tin? This is theatrics," she said, trying to hold the room as hers. My brother reached for the deed as if he could still snatch it back, fingers clumsy and panicked. The downtown lawyer, who had been so calm only moments before, opened his mouth and found that the right words had been replaced by surprise. He checked a clause under his breath and then, with a small cough, admitted the trust language required verification. "These are original documents," he muttered, then louder, "If these are valid, then the trustee will have to be consulted." I let the young lawyer take over because I had no intention of being the one to pull teeth out of family bones. He had already lined up witnesses: the bindery woman with ink under her fingernails and the old shop hand who could remember dates like other people remember birthdays. They stood then, slow and honest in the doorway, and told the room what they knew: how Grandpa had kept renewals paid, how he had told them in the shop to expect mischief if money smelled like change. The old woman read a short statement about seeing the patent paperwork tucked in Grandpa's drawer years ago and about a conversation where he had said to me, "Look after them, even if they don't look back." Her voice had no tiny tremble in it. It had the weight of someone who had carried a tool all her life. The lawyer from the downtown firm checked the trustee's contact right there, his tablet glowing, and a voice came back through on speaker from the bank. The representative was formal and courteous and blunt. The trust conditions had been met in intent and actions, and the bank would act to protect the trust assets. It was one of those moments I had rehearsed only in the quiet of the print shop, imagining the sound of a plan unraveling. The trustee would put interim oversight in place and, pending their review, transfer operational control to the steward named by my grandfather. He did not say my name, he read the line from the letter. The room tilted without moving. They protested. They accused us of forgery, of playing games, of bringing theater into business. My sister's face flushed, my mother's hands shook as she tried to clutch the ledger. My brother grew loud and complete with bravado, throwing around threats about countersuits and reputations. But the facts lined up like old, patient soldiers: signed renewals, canceled checks, witness statements, and a bank that was required by law and contract to follow a written directive. My younger lawyer read the audio clip of my sister saying, in a casual, joking tone, "We can get the temporary guardianship this week." And the room heard in real time what they had said to plan my removal. Recorded confession, old receipts, and a trustee ready to step in do not care much for pride. When the trustee representative explained next steps, it sounded like a bell for the end of a long race. The temporary guardianship filing would be halted, the proposed eviction nullified, and a temporary board would be installed to assess the company's operations. That board would operate under the stewardship clause Grandpa had written, stewardship that favored continuity, workers, and the press that kept the town's heartbeat. I sat there while they tried to bargain, to charm, to plead ignorance. Some offered tears, others claws. The table that had been their stage became a courtroom where evidence refused to lie. In the end, I did not roar. I did not bless them with a long sermon about their arrogance. I opened my mouth once and said the smallest thing that carried miles. You started this plan like a windstorm. You will finish it with people you can live with. The trustee would protect the assets, not punish out of spite. My lawyer laid out conditions: restitution for the workers they had planned to sack, reversal of the immediate lock changes, and a binding agreement that any future sale or transfer required unanimous consent with my written approval. They could accept those terms, keep some dignity, and work under oversight, or they could litigate and risk losing everything. My sister folded her arms and found that her grip held nothing. They had planned to cut me out, but they had not planned what a quiet man with a tin in his pocket and witnesses on his side could do. For a second, the room felt like an old radio that had stopped mid-broadcast, the hum gone and only the memory of sound left. Everybody froze as if someone had reached into the air and pinched a nerve. My sister's smile slid off like a mask dropped at the back of a stage. My brother's posture went from arrogance to gangly confusion. Even the courthouse lawyer from downtown looked like a man who had found a worm in his shoe on the way to a meeting. The tin sat between us like a small island of truth, and nobody knew which way the tide would pull. The bank representative, who had been formal and almost bored on the speaker, shifted into a tone that was clean and precise. He read the clause again, and this time the words did the work of a locksmith. He confirmed the trust was active under the conditions stated and that the bank would, under the will's instructions, step in to enforce stewardship. He explained, with the flatness of a machine reading out the weather, that any attempted transfer of assets, change of residence status, or locking out of a family member without unanimous consent would be paused and investigated. The downtown lawyer held the deed and the patent like a man who had discovered a legal grenade at his feet and did not want to touch it. That was when the room turned from stunned to panicked. My sister snatched for the deed out of habit as if grabbing it would rewrite the ink. Her fingers closed on nothing. My hand was already over the tin, not to fight but because the papers belonged to the truth and I wanted them to be handled clean. My brother started to speak, loud at first, sprinkling the usual threats about countersuits and reputations, but his sentences fell apart in the middle like bad stitching. He accused me, oddly, of staging a scene, as if I had conjured the whole thing from thin air. The bank rep's voice went colder and mentioned the legal duty the bank had to report any signs of forgery or coercion to the appropriate authorities. The word forgery landed with a distinct metallic taste in the room. They tried to pivot to charm the lawyer into finding a loophole, but words like charm and loophole felt thin next to signatures and canceled checks that had Grandpa's handwriting and my neighbor's memories attached. The bindery woman, who had been quiet until then, stepped closer and said the name of a date when Grandpa had spoken the words that mattered. Her voice was not trembling, it was firm and surprised the room into listening. The old shop hand dropped a calendar on the table, pointing at an entry where a renewal check had been noted. Small proofs, everyone thought, until they stacked into a mountain you could not leap over. My mother leaned forward then, her face losing its practiced calm like paint peeling from wood. She asked, in a voice that was hardly more than the tremor of a leaf, if there was some mistake. Her hands wrung the edge of the ledger until the pages bowed. For a moment I felt something like pity, a small hot thing that settled in my throat. Years of being treated like scenery do not vanish because a bank decides to honor a trust. But when she looked at me with those old, tired eyes, I could see the first real crack of recognition, that she had misread the map of my life. The downtown lawyer, the one who had been so ready to file forms and sign endings, did what lawyers do when facts run faster than fiction. He ran through the chain of custody on the documents, and with a suppressed sort of respect, admitted they appeared legitimate. He told my family plainly that the playing field had changed and that their proposed hearing would not be simple. He used words like injunction and trustee review and the possibility of criminal referral if coercion was involved. The room shrank for them. The air tasted of lemon cleaner and something else, a sour worry that roses when people realized their confidence was actually carelessness. My sister tried one last time to make a joke, a brittle, fast attempt to crack the tension. It came out like a sob. My brother's voice turned to a high, clumsy object, flailing in sentences he could not finish. They all began to stammer, the arrogance that had worn them like armor now gone soft with fear. They kept reaching for legal phrases they had once weaponized and found the words would not hold up. Their plans, their spreadsheets, and their staging photos were suddenly small things beside the weight of paper stamped and witnessed, and held in my hand. I sat there and watched the balance of the room slide until it was not about me being slow or small anymore, but about me holding the proof and them holding the guilt. The bindery woman folded her arms and looked at the others with something like contempt for the ease with which they decided my fate. The bank rep asked for copies to be sent immediately and placed a hold on any transfers. The trustee would be sending inspectors and a temporary oversight board within days. The great sound of their plotting, which had been loud and hungry for so long, collapsed into a quiet where each of them could finally hear their own conscience, or the lack of it. I felt no triumph that tasted like gloating. What filled me then was a clear sense of what had to come next, a list of small, precise tasks that would stitch the company and the house back together the way Grandpa had intended. The power had flipped in the room, and it did so cleanly enough that even those with the loudest voices could not find themselves a foothold. They stammered while I breathed, and in the silence that followed their collapse I let yesterday's wallpaper curl and watched the future straighten. When the trustee circled the legal paperwork and the bank confirmed the instructions, the room did not explode into triumph. It folded into a strange, careful silence like people stepping around broken glass. I could have worn their shock like a trophy, could have let a single sentence cut them and left it at that. Instead, I stood up, smoothed the tin on the table as if I were making room for coffee, and spoke with the flatness of someone reading from the manual of how to run a life. I laid out the facts first, because facts are the thing that make stubborn people listen. The trust required stewardship that preserved the business and the house for the community and the employees. The patent and the deed were protected. Any transfer required unanimous consent. The bank would enforce these points and had already put holds on any outflow. They were not being punished because I wanted vengeance. They were being stopped because their plan would have left people and livelihoods in the street. I am not a man who enjoys turning a family into a courtroom exhibit, but I am committed to a simple principle. You do not break what keeps a town alive. Then I put the terms on the table, not as theatrics, but as the kind of tidy, unromantic things a manager uses to make people accountable. First, the house. The deed in my hand made me the steward of the property. I told them simply, from the 1st of next month you will be our tenants. The house will be listed as non-transferable while the trust acts, and rent will be charged at a fair market rate equal to what a reasonable mortgage payment would be. I added that rent would not be pocketed by anyone in the family. It would be placed into a maintenance and community fund managed by the trustee. If they wanted to stay under their own roof, they would pay like anyone who lived there and keep the place up. If they wanted to leave, we would arrange a fair buyout, but only under trustee oversight. They flinched at the word rent as if I had pointed at a wound and spelled out its name. My sister had pictured profit and polish, a quick flip. She did not picture a ledger with her own name on one side and a monthly debit on the other. My brother, who had imagined steering invoices like a ship, heard the phrase fair market rate and realized there would be auditors now. Their faces changed color in the way a person sees cold for the first time. Second, the company. The trustee was installing a temporary oversight board to assess operations and to ensure the presses and the people who run them will not be abandoned. I was named interim steward pending that review, which meant I would chair the board at least until we set new, permanent governance. I announced the first actions. The locks would be changed back by the end of the day under supervision, the people who had been scheduled for layoffs would be reinstated, and any changes to employment or assets that had already been initiated would be reviewed with full transparency. I required that all communication about the company go through the board and that no unilateral moves be made. It was a careful cage, not a trap. I also put a practical, sharp pen through their plan with rules that showed I had thought about more than their hurt feelings. Any family member who wished to keep a position in the company would have to undergo a 6-month probation of meaningful work in the shop. The sister who had polished spreadsheets would have to manage client relations and learn the press schedules. The brother would work on the floor to understand production and meet the people his decisions affected. And my mother would resume organizing the weekly lunches for retirees she had once loved. If they preferred not to work, they could be tenants and keep their dignity in a quieter way. But they would not be decision-makers without earning it. There was a clause that surprised them most. The patent royalties, which had once been siphoned into corporate pockets, would be rerouted. A portion would fund an employee retirement fund and another portion would seed a community arts grant. My grandfather had not just been hiding paper, he had been making sure whatever power he handed down would help keep the town whole. That was the moral center of his trust, and I intended to keep it beating. Money had teeth, but it could also build bridges. I remember my sister's hands twitching, as if she were still trying to gather spreadsheets into something more than they were. She tried bargaining with charm with a small, practiced smile, but the trustee had already drawn up the mechanics and the board would not bend for charm. My brother raised his voice and tried threats, the old rude thing he always did when he felt small. I listened and then cut the conversation with a single clear sentence. If you litigate, you risk losing everything. If you work with the trustee, you keep a house and a company and the respect you forgot existed. That was not a threat, it was an accounting lesson. I did not demand apologies. I did not call for dramatic renunciations. I demanded simple acts of repair, restore the people they tried to fire, undo the illegal changes they had started, and contribute labor or rent to the fund that repairs roofs and pays wages. The trustee would monitor compliance and had the power to remove family members from management if they did not meet the terms. Justice in this room looked like methodical paperwork and slow audits rather than vengeance. It felt to me like what Grandpa would have wanted, practical, unglamorous, and fair. When it was over, I sat back down and felt the weight of the documents in my lap like the warm weight of a sleeping dog. My family left the room with their faces rearranged into a mixture of anger and reluctant calculation. The press in the shop was my steady companion again, humming exactly as it always had. The wallpaper in my room still peeled at the corner where I had started to pry it months ago. I ran my fingers along that curl and did not feel the need to cover it up. I was still quiet. I was still the man who brewed his tea slow and liked his routines. Only now the town's patent and the house that had seemed to belong to everyone were watched by a steady hand. I am the man they called simple and slow, and if you ask me now I will tell you this: being underestimated is not the same as being weak. Sometimes it is armor. Sometimes it is patience arranged like a careful plan. They thought they could sell the wallpaper and toss us out the door. Instead, they found themselves paying rent to the man they dismissed. I did not raise my voice. I did not dance on their mistakes. I did what needed to be done and then went back to work, because owning their future did not feel like triumph. It felt like responsibility, and I intend to keep it that way.